Hello and welcome. I'm Sarah Barrett Neal, Gallery Manager with the Glen Arbor Arts Center. In conversation today with Marsha MacDowell, Professor of Art History and Visual Culture at Michigan State University. Today we're talking about quilts. The history of Western art has been predominantly about objects made by white men who have determined whose voices and whose stories were heard. That reality began to shift in the late 20th century and continues today. And as a result, it's now an accepted fact that people who are making visual art represent all races, genders, and worldviews. Quilts are a particularly interesting way to examine those advances in our understanding of what themes, ideas, materials, and techniques are worthy of legitimate consideration. Our query today is why quilts are to be taken seriously. And there's no one better than Marsha MacDowell to talk about that question. Let me tell you a little bit more about Marsha. Since 1977, Marsha has been a curator at Michigan State University's museum and has served as coordinator of the Michigan Traditional Arts Program. Her research into and advocacy of the quilt has taken many forms, from exhibitions to published books to the development of the Quilt Index, a digital repository of thousands of images and stories about quilts. Marsha is the director of the Quilt Index. Welcome, Marsha, and thank you for sitting through all that.
Glad to be here.
I want to set up our conversation with a little bit of historical context. Um, Quilts, as you well know, are inextricably tied in most people's minds to the home, and they're viewed as utilitarian objects made by women. As a result, they've been dismissed and left out of the art historical record traditionally. That view, as I said earlier, began evolving in the 1960s when studio artists began exploring quilts as a medium of creative expression, divorced from their traditional role and utility. Um, Another few inflection points. There were two major museum exhibitions that looked at quilts as from a design perspective. There were the arrival of quilt-centric organizations such as Studio Art Quilt Associates and the Dairy Barn exhibition, Quilt National in Athens, Ohio, began in the latter part of the last century and is still one of the most competitive and prestigious exhibitions of studio and contemporary quilts. So, having said all that, how do you think studio artists' embrace of quilt making has changed people's perception of the quilt?
I'll actually layer on one more facet in terms of the attention to quilts, and that is the group of scholars who are in art history and folklore and other fields who were beginning to research quilts and write about them. So that, with the artists who were making them, really set the stage for increased interest in quilts. But I think if we want to just take it from the studio art perspective or the maker perspective, I think that the kinds of scholarship that was coming out, the critical acclaim that was garnered by those exhibitions, particularly the two that you spoke of that were in New York City, when an art critic from the New York Times calls one of those exhibits the 10 best exhibits of art in New York City, that is stamping a stamp of approval
Mhm.
on an art form that hadn't been looked at as a serious art form previously. So I think it motivated more individuals who already had the skills of sewing, had ready materials at hand, the fabric and the machinery if they chose to not do hand sewing. And they could take all of those elements, so skills, materials, techniques, equipment, and make art that was not any longer just for the bed as a quilt form, but could be intended to be a wall hanging, to be seen as an art piece on a wall. That's not to say that there haven't been decades of women making quilts that were for beds, but essentially they were pieces of art on a bed. But it was the shift to taking it off the bed and seeing it on the wall. I think that was very significant.
I was just thinking this morning about how easy it is um, to begin quilt making.
Hmm.
There's not many hurdles to jump. Any scraps from the household will do, a needle, thread, some scissors, maybe a few pins, and you're off to the races.
It's not costly. That is not costly. It's accessible.
Mhm.
It's not costly. Importantly, in a woman's life, you are constantly interrupted. You've got,
Yeah.
you know, if you have a family, if you have a partner, if you have a family, if you have a home, constant interruptions in your daily activities. Quilt making is something you can easily pick up and put back down.
Right.
So you can fit it into the spaces in your life when you want to be able to do something that's not cooking or cleaning or getting the kids off to school, etc., which is really different than an art form like sculpture or oil painting, where you've got to have space. You have to have serious equipment. You have to have oil paints exude smells. It's disruptive to the people around you. So you have to have the time and the space, and it's just more difficult to get up and running with those other art forms.
The other thing that's so interesting to me about contemporary studio built quilts is they've torpedoed the old craft versus capital A art debate.
Mhm.
Um, these kinds of quilts challenge all the rules about what materials are acceptable for fine art making. So, specifically, how do you think that's changed? Who gets to tell the stories that are part of human creativity and culture?
I think that, well, I think one of the interesting things that been a lot of women who have been writing about quilt arts. And I also think it's thousands and thousands of women, tens of thousands of predominantly women were involved in some of the early quilt documentation efforts. So I think it's the interest of women studying quilts and interests of women who are studying quilts because they know it is an art form made by predominantly women that needs to be addressed, needs to be documented, needs to be put back into history. So I think there is that part of it is that the groundswell of women who were not only making but also documenting quilts.
The Western art historical record is predominantly dominated by people who paint and sculpt.
Correct.
So let's discuss a little bit the history of Western art and how is it made more dynamic slash healthier
Mhm.
slash vigorous when quilts, like we're talking about, are given serious regard, serious academic and popular consideration.
I think that it points to the fact that there is creative energy by individuals that manifests itself into objects uh, that we haven't taken seriously beyond the historical attention to painting and sculpture. And that the quilts certainly blew up that attention to non-painting, um, non-sculptural forms. But it opened up the door to look at creativity and crocheting and knitting and tatting and macrame and el different techniques of producing a creative work
Hmm.
that had not heretofore been really looked at. I just recently reviewed a book about African arts and uh, all forms of arts across the continent that were all textile related. And and every one of them, every one of the articles in this book was digging deep into one very small form of textile art making. But each article was like a window into a culture, into a time period, but only seen through those threads, those textiles. And I think that's what we are so excited about, those of us who are studying this kind of material, is that we're looking at the things that had been glossed over.
Hmm.
And if we turn our attention to those elements of our material cultural history, we realize they actually have embedded in them clues to understanding the larger culture, the larger time period. So, yeah, I think that it's important to be addressing the things that are have been hidden production of art.
As you're talking, the thought goes to my head that there's so many clues to human life in a scrap of textile.
Oh, absolutely. And my friend Dr. Carolyn Maslumi often makes that comment about we're born into this world swaddled in a textile, in a blanket and a bunting, and we exit this world in some kind of shroud, another textile form. So yeah, we're constantly in interaction with textiles, whether or not we realize it or not.
In 2016, your book, Quilts and Human Rights, was published. And in that book, you explore the intersection of traditional quilt making and social activism. And you highlight how fiber artists use their craft to address and protest human rights violations. You talk about the ways quilts, quote, advance awareness of critical human rights issues: suffrage, race relations, civil wars, natural disasters, HIV/AIDS, and ethnic, sexual, and gender discrimination. So that is a big basket of things. And the question that went through my mind was, what do you think make quilts an especially good medium for taking on difficult themes and subjects such as these?
I think it is the fact that because it is construed as being linked to domesticity, because it is thought of as being handmade only. So you're always thinking about the connection to home, to a person, heart. So it's warm and fuzziness. Uh, and for most people, they think that quilts are apolitical, that there couldn't possibly be a hard side to them. That yet, if you look at the kinds of quilts that are used to uh, express experiences with human rights violations or to be an advocate for human rights, civil rights, you will find that these that these pieces um, might because they look like they're warm and fuzzy, might draw you into looking at them, and then suddenly you're surprised. Oh my God, that is not just a that's just not a regular quilt. That's a quilt that has this amazing story attached to it. And that story is difficult. That even if a quilt, and I think we'll in a few minutes we'll look at maybe one of them, and but even if a quilt is very ordinary in its appearance, it might have this just incredible story that's deeply disturbing and raises awareness of that issue in our lives. On the other hand, there are a lot of quilts that are made for human rights activism that actually are pictorial, and so you can easily grasp the image. But I think if you were to go to, if you saw an exhibition titled notice of a exhibition titled Quilts and Human Rights, you go, oh, I love quilts. I'm going to go see that quilt exhibit, not really thinking that the content of the exhibit might be difficult, but you're just mad about quilts because quilt shows, people go to quilt shows all the time.
It seems as though the superpower of the quilt is its perceived comfort and familiarity.
Mhm.
That breaks down a lot of barriers, as you're just describing. People will edit out the quilts and human rights part of the human rights part of it. But once you get them in the door and get people thinking about it because they're so comfortable with the object, then lots of things can happen from there.
Absolutely. And again, because um, we have looked at so many quilts that portray very intimate experiences with quilts and human rights, you realize that the individual artists who made those quilts, describing their experiences, were constantly touching that fabric, thinking about it. So there's all that element of hands-on, um, tactile experience with a quilt.
The book pays tribute to individuals who have used needle skills, and I'm quoting you here, to prick the conscience and encourage action against human rights violations. So, can you talk a little bit about how quilt making provides a platform for more and different voices to talk about and reflect upon the world, and why this is a good thing? And if you have an example of that, let's see it.
Okay. How about if we screen share right now?
Yeah.
Let's see. I going to it right now. Let's see. No, the sharing is not turned on.
Oh, I'm going to allow you to do that. Sorry.
That's okay. So here's one quote right here. Can you see that?
I sure can.
Okay, that's an example of a quilt that you say, oh, yeah, that's a quilt. It's not particularly spectacular design, interesting, sort of ordinary fabrics. And you can see a side of the quilt that's turned up so you can see the back of it. It's done in a what they call an English paper piecing style. So if one were to go to an exhibit and see that quilt, they'd go, oh, ho hum, I think I want to go to the next quilt that looks pictorially smashing. The design is smashing. But if you stood in front of this quilt long enough and read the label, you would learn that it was actually made by Barbara Hogan, who was the first white South African to be imprisoned during apartheid for her political act, her anti-apartheid political activities. And so she was even at one time in isolation, but in prison, she made quilts. And okay, she was not going to the store to buy and select these particular fabrics. Her She was limited by what the warders could were willing to give her in terms of scraps of material, or friends and family who would visit and they could give her these scraps of material. And Barbara didn't really know how to quilt. She taught herself in prison. So here's an individual in prison just for her political activities and cut off from the rest of the world, except for these limited opportunities for friends and family to be able to do short visits. But she made these quilts. And Barbara eventually got out of prison when the South African government, the new Democratic, she got out of prison because the government uh, unbanned the political activism and the prisoners who had been put in jail because of their activities. So her release from prison was unexpected. And so she never finished this quilt. She carried it out of prison with her. We included it in an exhibition of quilts and human rights. And I was friends with her and am friends with her. And she and I were talking one day, and I asked her about how prisoners coped in that in their incarceration with that boredom. And she said, well, a number of people did crafts. And I said, well, what did you do? And she said, well, I quilted. And then she showed me this quilt that she made. And what's really telling about the importance of quilting in individuals' lives is she also said that quilting saved my life while I was in prison because it gave me something to do. She made quilts, she gave them to other women. She just happened to be have this one with her when she was unexpectedly released from prison. Barbara went on to become the Minister of Health in South Africa. She was minister of another unit in government and is revered as a anti-apartheid activist in that country. But here she was making quilts. So to circle back to your your question about, that sort of the democratization of quilting, and how it allows so many individuals to be artists. So you will find quilts being made by individuals regardless of, their race, their economic situation, their it's gender, sex. People make quilts. Now, if there is an element that does exclude some people in that if you're not using scrap material from around the house, the economics of it can be exclusive. And if you're using high-priced sewing machines to do your art, then that makes it difficult economically. But if you're just relying on hand sewing and using fabrics at hand or salvaged or thrift shopped, you can make art at a relatively low price.
It's so interesting to hear about this quilt, and the way you set it up is just beautiful and makes the power of it so much more apparent. You're right. You would walk up to this thing hanging on a wall and you go, ho hum, where's the next one? But as with so many objects, the story is really everything. The story is what enlivens and makes this thing dance. And if we don't have more and more people involved in making, then we don't hear all these stories. My feeling about this quilt is entirely changed,
Yes.
not only because of the story of the maker, but how she made it.
And actually, I'll just make a comment about the paper that was used in that construction technique is that one of the things Barbara was allowed also to do in prison was to take a correspondence course from another university. I think it was University of South Africa, UNISA. And so she had correspondence workbooks that were sent her. And so she tore out the pages of the workbook and cut them into squares and used those to in that English paper construction technique.
Use the materials
Yes.
for hand.
Yeah, and so looking at this, this really tells you something about prison history. It tells you something about Barbara Hogan's history. It tells you something about South African history. So there are many ways in which this particular quilt can convey many messages.
Absolutely. Um, I want to talk about the quilt index a little bit.
Okay, can I get
Sure.
out of
And thank
now?
you for sharing that lovely quilt.
Yeah, now I'm trying to get out. Oh, shoot. Okay. Oh, stop share. Okay, sorry.
No, no, this
There
is
you go.
the world we live in right now.
Yes,
Um, the Quilt Index, that's a very straightforward name for a very significant project. Um, when I looked at the website, there's nearly 100,000 quilts
right,
represented.
right.
Their stories are preserved, and the stories of their makers are also preserved. So, how is the Quilt Index used?
Ah, it is used constantly by scholars who are doing research because you can do searches and sorts of that big data set. Almost 100,000. We'll be reaching 100,000 within 2 months. Um, that's a big data set, and we have tools that will allow a person to search and sort. So you can search by pattern, by time period, by maker's name, by location made, by function, whether it was intended to be used on the wall or as a bed cover, or maybe it was used for a commemorative purpose, or, well, um, so because of those search tools and that abilities to then display, search and display, you can, as a researcher, look at the continuum of patterns that change over time, or even log cabin quilts, because there's a ton of log cabin quilts in there. Um, you can see all of the variations of designs, the way that fabric has been put together, sets, blocks have been set differently, so that you went, oh, I thought log cabin was one kind of iteration, when in fact there are multiple iterations depending on what fabric you use, etc. So research, but research by scholars who are studying the quilts, but research by artists who want to be inspired, who want to get ideas for their projects. So we're hearing about that all the time. Quilts are being used by scholars who uses a means to access data that they could not access any other way. And so they're using it to write refereed articles, dissertations, etc. I was interviewed last week by a public broadcasting station in San Diego, and they were investigating the Quilt Index to prepare for the development of a story that they were writing. Um, Quilts are also used, or the index is also used for genealogy. We're constantly hearing from people who have found a reference to a quilt made by a relative that they didn't even know existed. And so I just got an inquiry like that yesterday. And so genealogy, artistic practice, creative practice, scholarly research in women's studies, textile history, it's used constantly.
Uh, I'm pausing because I'm trying to think of a gentle way to get into this, but there's no gentle way to. The Quilt Index has
Mhm.
supported in part by grants by the National Endowment for the Humanities and Institute for Museum and Library Services, both of which are being gutted by the administration as part of a cost saving effort. What does that mean for the vitality of the index and its future?
At the moment, it's sustainable, but it means that we can't do a number of the special things that we wanted to do. Um, we are a very small team of individuals who work on this. It's a big project with a tiny little group of people who keep it going. Um, so we can't do a lot of the technological upgrades right now that we want to keep fresh. We can't put in more collections without this subsidies from federal sources. Um, I'm pleased to say that a couple of years ago, we created a capacity within the Quilt Index for you or anybody else to sit at their computer and upload their own information, their own story, their own image of their quilt into the Quilt Index. Again, trying to make it a democratic tool for everyone to have access to preserving their own story and preserving their own uh, art making. But yes, it's difficult. We do have we have a donate button. We're hoping that, like public radio and public television, that people will step up and as they enjoy using the Quilt Index, that they understand that there are expenses in the background that need to be tended to. But thank you for bringing that up because um, those federal agencies in particular have been tremendous in helping us over the past over 20 years now in doing the development that's needed to happen to create a resource like this that captures our American history in this way.
In the context of this conversation, where we're talking about people's voices and voices telling stories, um, just to continue with that analogy, the Quilt Index is just screaming with voices. It's a cacophony of voices.
Yes, and but I will say that because it started out by building its content based on what had been documented through state quilt documentation projects. A lot of those projects had limitations. They had limitations. Some states said, oh, I'm not going to document anything past 1950. Others just were done predominantly by um, white women who did not have the access points to non-white quilting traditions. So a few years ago, we got grants, including one from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which was just cut to beef up the content of African American and African American diaspora quilters and their stories, their work in the Quilt Index. So over the last 3 years, we've been working with African American quilt artists, quilt organizations, museums that have collections of African American quilts to get that content into the Quilt Index. And we had in the works a similar project that was going to deal with Indigenous quilt history. So that's been paused for the moment until we can find an alternate source of funding. But in those two examples, we were being, as a small team of people, we were being proactive in making sure that the quilt index was diverse in what it contains so that it wouldn't be a skewed history of quilt making in this country.
Quilts have been an important part of your professional life for decades.
Mhm.
I'm why?
I think, well, two things. One is when I was born, I immediately became a owner of quilts because my great grandmothers had made quilts for baby MacDowell. And so I grew up sleeping under quilts that were made by my two great grandmothers, and even carried one with me to when I went to Michigan State University to school. So I always and I knew my great grandmothers, especially one who was an avid quilt maker. She passed away when I was 16, so I had plenty of time to get to know her. And she was a quilter in Detroit. Um, she and her group quilted on Belle Isle in the summer. I mean, we're very much part of the 1930s, 40s quilting scene in Detroit. But when I went to college, I did have an incident where it was a trigger point for me that I was studying American art history and I had a class and proposed a project actually analyzing and doing more investigation into my great grandmother, especially the Detroit one, who made quilts. And the professor, a man, said he thought that was an inconsequential idea and come back with a more serious idea. That made me mad. So I went, I'm dropping the course and I'm going to do what I wanted to do, which was to do research on why did my great grandmother quilt? Where did she get her fabrics? What possessed her to make all these quilts when she had no resources herself during the Depression years? And she made these beautiful, beautifully crafted, beautifully designed, beautiful quilts. And so I'm lucky to have inherited those quilts, but I now feel like I've justified, even though I don't really know her story, because at age 16, I wasn't asking these kinds of questions. Um, I feel like paying tribute to her quilts, and you can see them in the quilt index.
There's nothing worse than to tell a person who has a burning interest in finding
Yeah,
out answers that
yeah,
the project doesn't have worth.
yeah, yeah. So many books later, the quilt index, 100,000. I mean, I think it might be, I don't, the largest repository of American art that's out there. And I think it tells volumes about this is an important art making aspect of our American history.
Marsha, thank you for your scholarship, for your perseverance, for your dogged.
My stubbornness.
Things don't get done if there's not stubborn people. I thank you so much. We'll have plenty of links to all the things we've talked about. And thanks to everyone who's been watching and listening. And we'll see you next time.